Humanity has been developing some incredible tools for understanding the complexity of our world. Computing, data collection and analysis, communications, satellite imagery. A lot of different tools and techniques are coming along so that we can have better understanding of the impact of our choices. And this can guide better public policy so that we collectively can be more mindful about our choices and our behavior. So, amid some really scary and sad issues that humanity is facing right now, I draw some optimism and hope when I discover really smart people doing amazing work in the world to solve these problems. One of them is with me today. Greg Taff of the World Resources Institute talks with me about how data geeks are saving humanity. Let's dig in. This is the joy of saving the human race, where we try to get the world to cooperate. It's so the human race can avoid some urgent global problems that could mean the end of civilization and cause lots of suffering around the world. But also, we just want to have a good world that we enjoy and we can feel proud of. We are not just citizens of our own countries, we are citizens of the human race. Let's learn to manage ourselves responsibly. Let's help the human race act like it wants to last for a while. I think humans are awesome, and the human race is worth saving. There is no time to waste, so let's do this. Hi friends, welcome to the joy of saving the human race. I'm Shelby Murtis. I'm really excited about today's show. This is going to be a fun one. Partly because this is the first time I'm interviewing someone on the show. It's so far just been me solo, which has been fun, but I want to talk to other people because there's a lot of smart people out there to talk to. I just want to let you know before we start that you are listening to this show somewhere. There are multiple places to listen to this show. So it's on YouTube, it's on Spotify, it's on most podcast players. It's also on my website, www.joyofsavingthehumanrace.com. So you have multiple ways to listen to this and be a part of the movement to make a world we can be proud of. So, and also share it with your friends. Please, let's grow this thing. So, all right, well, today's guest I'm excited about. We're going to talk with Greg Taff, who works for the World Resources Institute as their Director of Research and Data Integrity. And for full transparency, I'll tell you, I have known Greg just about forever. We first met when we were in third grade and became friends. And you can tell I have some gray hairs, so that was a little while back. And so here we are talking over the internet on a podcast and YouTube channel. And back when we met, there was no internet. There was no YouTube. There was no podcasts. So I think way back then, we would have to use extreme imagination to know that we would be doing this right now. So I'm having Greg here not just because he's my friend, but also because he's wicked smart and he's interesting to talk to and he does fascinating work. So this will be a good conversation. So Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shelby. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
So can we start with you giving us just a real brief summary of what the World Resources Institute is and what you guys do?
Absolutely. World Resources Institute is an environmental development non-government organization. And I'm actually going to read you the mission, which is very brief.
Yeah.
WRI's mission is to move human society to live in ways that protect Earth's environment and its capacity to provide for the needs and aspirations of current and future generations. So that's WRI's mission statement. And WRI is, I would say, first and foremost, a research organization, but WRI considers itself a think tank and a do tank, which is kind of a new term. And the idea is that we're also putting the research into action and helping the with interventions at government levels, at with companies and with other non-government organizations and communities. So, and kind of all levels, working in primarily the developing world and the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, we work a lot with data and information and getting it into the hands of the people that need it to make decisions to actually make a positive impact on the environment while allowing development to continue in the place in all the places where we work.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And I would recommend that listeners go check out the website of World Resources Institute. I've prowled around there and just learned a lot. It's fascinating, all the stuff that they're doing. So I encourage you to just go take a look at it. Of course, I'll have a link for you in the show notes you can click. But some of the main issue areas I saw worked on there were climate, forests, ocean, food security, water security, cities, oceans. I might be missing a couple, but these are all research areas that are, as
energy,
we know,
yeah.
Energy, exactly, all critically important. So,
So it's quite a broad organization, and there's over 1,500 people working there now. And when I started just less than 3 years ago, there were just over 800 people. So it's grown very quickly. Yeah. And I forgot what I was going to say about that, but
that's huge growth, though. I mean, that's might be kind of dizzying, actually, to double an organization in 3 years.
Absolutely. So we're having to, kind of put some things into processes and protocols that we haven't before in order to manage the growth. And it's a bit of a challenge, but it's also exciting in terms of the effect and impact I think the organization is having, which is also increasing very substantially.
Yeah. So your job there is Director of Research and Data Integrity. What does that mean? What do you do?
Okay, well, along with my team, I've got several on my team. We try to, we do what the title says, and that is to try to maintain integrity throughout the organization in the research and also in data products that we produce or that we curate. We do that in several ways. The most prominent way within the organization is that we're overseeing the review process of our publications. So we produce our own reports and issue briefs and working papers and a few other different kind of knowledge products, as we call them, which are different types of papers, basically. And we publish it. It's very similar in a way that's very similar to how peer-reviewed journals publish their papers. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, we're like the editors of the journal that is WRI's set of publications. So what we do is we review a lot of the publications. We also oversee the review process that we have for the organization, which includes a pretty rigorous set of internal reviewers, meaning folks within WRI, and external reviewers, meaning anyone outside of WRI. Most publications have a minimum of 8 reviewers outside of ourselves, and we try and get folks, someone to review it who's from maybe a competing viewpoint. What sets us apart from some peer-reviewed academic journals is that we also require reviews from user groups. So our users aren't usually academics. Sometimes they are. They're part of our intended audience. But our intended audiences, be they government officials, be they community members, or non-government organizations, we need to make sure that those folks review it and give feedback. And then my department, we oversee how the authors address how the authors address the reviewer comments. And we kind of give the final approval to go out for publication, along with the program director, who is the kind of the more topical lead within their team. So it's quite an extensive review process, and we oversee that and manage that. In addition, we try to build capacity among the staff for research. some, there's a lot of different levels that come in of people who are doing research. Some folks have never done research before. Some folks are very, they've been doing it for a long time and have published many articles in many different venues. So we try and help build various research skills throughout the organization. And we try to work with staff as much as possible from an early stage of the research, ideally at or before the proposal development, and then through, determining what the research questions are and what the method will be to answer those research questions. And then in terms of, once the research is done, to write it up and give support however we can in terms of the writing. And then, of course, comes the review process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It sounds really interesting. And when I first heard about the work you're doing, I found it pretty fascinating that you get to sort of have your hands on a lot of different issue areas and a lot of different research being done, and kind of see the whole breadth of the organization and what's being generated there, which is pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, for me, it's been great. I originally was a professor, and then I worked at a research institute in Norway for about 7 years as a researcher myself. And then when I came here as kind of a research director of sorts, it's really changed. I'm not doing my own research almost at all, but I'm learning so much because I'm reviewing and reading and discussing research with folks from all these different areas we mentioned earlier at WRI. And for me, I'm learning a lot, and I really enjoy the opportunity to, help try to really make our research better and understandable to all audiences and be able to work in all these different areas. So it's been a joy for me. And like I said, the learning has been the biggest thing that I'm learning about energy and forests and water and oceans in ways that I haven't before. So it's really great.
Yeah, that's awesome. So let me kind of frame this conversation I want to have with you today about how data and research tools are advancing and giving us new capabilities to deal with humanity's issues. So part of what motivated me to have this conversation today is that I've been slightly depressed lately. I've been doing a bunch of research on the dark, scary things that humanity is on the verge of damaging. And so I've been immersed in climate change and destruction of nature and pandemics and nuclear weapons and dangerous technology and all this horrible stuff. It can kind of get me down. So I thought it could be fun to talk with someone involved in good work where smart people are solving problems and making things better, But another nugget of this is I had this idea recently where I was thinking about climate change and how this just crept up on us over many decades. Humanity unleashed these horrible forces on the world, but nobody went out and said, hey, I want to destroy the climate. That was never the intention. That was just an accident. And when fossil fuels started being used, no one knew the impact that would have. And I look back at previous generations, and it seems almost like they were just stumbling around in the wilderness, breaking things, not knowing what they were doing. And now fast forward, we kind of understand how this stuff works, and we don't have to just stumble around and break things. We can actually, have tools to understand the consequences of our choices and collectively just make better choices using these tools, And so kind of comparing back then with now, I feel more confidence that maybe we can pull this off. Maybe we can, as humanity, get our act together by just being more aware of what we're doing, Am I on the right track here? Do you feel this kind of optimism on this front?
Yeah, well, I think I feel both of your feelings. It certainly can be, a little are more than a little overwhelming to think about all the environmental and development problems in the world today, and we can't let ourselves get stuck in the depression of it. I think because it's easy to do, but it doesn't help anybody and doesn't help ourselves. And so the best thing we can do is try to help, and hopefully we'll be able to make enough changes in the amount of time that we need to in order to not have, really quite catastrophic consequences, and to learn to adapt to the changes that we know will happen. So, but it's a good point that, we are working with a lot more knowledge now, and more knowledge comes out every day. And so, the more we can harness that knowledge and work with the right actors to actually make an impact, the more chance we have to avoid the catastrophic problems, to have more equitable and comprehensive development around the world for folks everywhere in a way that's sustainable.
Yeah. So we have now at our disposal these tools we did not used to have, like modern computing, the ability to collect more data and analyze it. We've got satellite imagery. We've got other ways of collecting data. These are pretty awesome tools. Like, what is the impact of these tools on current decision making? Like, how is this stuff making a difference in the world in terms of grappling with these hard problems?
Well, I would start to say that actually a lot of it has to do with the interaction of knowledge and politics, and the areas where politics is actually taking the knowledge into account. Then there's been some pretty amazing movements in countries where politics are kind of setting aside science and not listening, and focused on what I think is short-term gain for a subset of actors in the country. Then obviously the more knowledge we have, it doesn't really make it an effect. So I think everything starts with good governance, which also supports the science itself. But in a lot of cases, the data and the information that's getting into the hands of not just folks of government, but in companies, in nonprofits, and into communities has really made differences. I mean, I certainly can't go into all of them, but I can give some examples.
Please.
One is, I'll say, like WRI has a lot of what we call data platforms. They're usually websites or something that can be like an app on a cell phone. And we try to basically, with these data platforms, we get information into the hands of people who can use it to make decisions on the ground. So one good example is Global Forest Watch. That's probably our best known data platform. And what that does is it basically ingests data that's updated every week or two, that basically takes information from satellite images all over, that are monitoring the ground all over the earth, and it monitors where there are fires occurring in forests, and where forests are being cut down. And getting this information to folks on the ground, within days or weeks at the most, can really help to prevent problems from popping up that are more long term. So the easy example is if there's some illegal forest cutting, and this information gets to into the hands of rangers and forests, and they can go out there and stop the illegal forest cutting right away. And this is happening a lot in Indonesia. We have a lot of success. We've had a lot of contact with folks in Indonesia, where we're working with governments and local governments, and actually seeing a decline in forest loss in Indonesia. And we think part of it is due to this data platform and being used over there. And I will add that it's not just the data itself. Maybe we can get into this more later, but it's really having someone who's perhaps creating the data or knowledgeable about the data. Someone from WRI, for instance, or a lot of folks from WRI work with the folks on the ground to make sure they're understanding how to use this, to make sure we understand what they need so we can, maybe present the data in new ways or get a different set of data for them. And this kind of two-way interaction with folks in order to understand how best to use this data and how best they can receive the data and take action on it. Just having the data out there alone doesn't usually, make enough impact. It's really working with folks to use the data.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting to hear you say that, because I think over history, there's been tons of research done about a ton of things. And sometimes great research can just sit in an academic journal or something where the public doesn't even know it's there, or a politician doesn't even know it's there. There could be great knowledge that's just sort of locked away and not really used and not made applicable to the person who needs to use it in a good way. So it's interesting to hear you say that this kind of work, it requires all the analytical ability, of course, but also involves people skills and connections and relationships to make it work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of WRI's real strengths, which is why I think WRI has been so successful to work, at levels with the UN and at high levels and lower levels in the governments all around the world to actually have an impact, because we really do focus on those people skills. But what my job is trying to make sure that all this stuff that we do and all this interaction and the interventions we help to promote are based on solid research, so we know that we're actually trying to suggest the best interventions, or the best, some of the best interventions that we can.
Yeah. So do you, with this interaction between your organization with like people on the ground, or with businesses, or with governments, is this you guys coming up with good research that you think people need to know and getting it to them? Or do they come to you with requests for stuff that they want figured out, or both?
Well, I would say that's a good question for sure. I think it's all of the above. I would say we try our best, and I think we need to do better. But we're doing our best to incorporate folks on the ground. The key stakeholders, the key people who a lot of interventions may be affecting. We try and incorporate them early on into the research, so we're understanding their needs and their concerns and their thoughts. But in terms of responding to research needs, I would say that's more often sometimes governments, but most often the funders. We have a lot of foundations and governments that are funding our work. A lot of times the funders or the funding governments may be European governments or government of Canada, more developed world funders, and the governments of the recipient countries are often that's where we work, is in, let's say, a lot of areas in Africa and South America, East Asia, so a lot of times we're responding to requests from these developed world governments in order to influence the developing world, in order to influence the developing world in general.
Yeah. Well, I'm imagining too that this kind of work you're describing is really maybe especially useful in developing countries that are poor, because they don't have that capacity themselves. So a government, and often there's this relationship between poverty and environmental destruction, which we see over and over, or other issues that you deal with. But the U.S. government might be able to hire a bunch of researchers to tackle something, but the government of Indonesia might not be able to. There's sort of a difference in capacity that you can sort of fill in.
Yes. And a lot of times it'll just be the money that's coming from the government or from, like I said, or foundations. And then with certain, very specific goals that they want to fulfill, and that some of that money goes to us or other NGOs, and some of the money will go directly to the recipient countries, and we'll work with them as partners to implement, research and interventions as necessary.
Yeah.
But capacity is part of the issue a lot, but there's a lot of capacity in the developing countries as well, and a lot of times it's just the funding or coalition building that is more necessary, and things like this that we can play a role in as well.
Yeah, yeah. So with these kind of tools that we're describing of, that are allowing you to do better research, better mapping, better data analysis and whatever, is this helping us uncover connections between different policy issues that in the past may have been handled separately? So like, poverty and economics versus the environment, or even the protection of nature or climate, like sometimes you might have government agencies handling these things separately, but they're really tightly intertwined. And sometimes people haven't always recognized that in their choices.
Yeah, I would say, that's a real challenge from a political standpoint, or from not necessarily political, but from just an institutional, a government institutional standpoint, is that they're often work in pillars that are separate. Mm-hmm. And these are issues that are obviously intertwined, as you say. So, but I think getting them to work together is getting more and more important. That talk about mainstreaming ideas of gender and environment into all the different aspects of government. So these are some of the important issues. But from a research standpoint, yeah, I think things are moving in a way where we're connecting different issues better. We have, I'd say one good example is another data platform we have called Resource Watch. And it's similar to Global Forest Watch, but we're trying to focus on a much broader set of environmental issues and social issues as well. And so we have over, I don't remember the number, but I know it's over 200 data sets that are all spatial data sets. So it's like as you come to the page on resourcewatch.org, you'll see, if you explore the data, you'll see a world map, and you can add or subtract a whole bunch of different data layers, any of these 200 data layers, and you can zoom in, zoom out, and see how what some of the interactions are. Of course, sometimes it can be a little, it can give folks a false sense of understanding, because we don't know that just because two data layers are overlaid and we see what seems to be a correlation doesn't mean that one is causing the other. It could be very different issues, but at least we can start to see some of these different processes, how they interact, spatially with other processes or other data sets. So it's certainly exciting what could be possible, and the question is figuring out what data sets to put together, and how to analyze it, and then for what purpose, and how that information is used.
Yeah. So like for that tool that you mentioned, what might some of the layers be that you can overlap and see comparisons with?
Yeah. Well, one thing we have is there's one tool that I think allows you to see an estimate of how much of what areas on Earth would be covered up by an X amount of meters of sea level rise, right? Yeah. So what areas are below 1 meter above sea level right now, or 1.5 meters or 5 meters or whatever. Of course, this, we can build levees, and we can build dam systems and things like this, and ways to protect areas that are below sea level. But in general, it gives you kind of a broad overview of the areas that are more at risk. We have a water peace and security tool that looks at areas that it overlays information from press releases and just press in general, and a few other data sets, I think, that collect information on where there's unrest, civil unrest happening, violence. And then we overlay that onto an area that looks at, where there's been drought and where there's risk of either flooding or more drought, and trying to show and see if, what that relationship is in terms of areas that have real water risks, and what that, if that results sometimes in violence, because just, water is obviously our most precious resource, and when there's a water shortage, it's just a ripe opportunity for bad actors to make use of the situation, or try and take control of the few water resources there are. So that's, an area where we're kind of bringing disparate sources of information together to try and understand what's happening.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as you describe that, what occurs to me is that it could be a great resource for the international community, like, the United Nations and their agencies and various governments around the world, to know where hotspots are about to develop. So like the water security and violence issue, we could see, oh, they're going to run out of water in 10 years, and that's going to be bad. Like, let's get in there and do something before the crisis happens. That would be a great opportunity if we were using it well.
Yeah, I agree, and that's the goal. That's certainly the goal. And of course, a lot of this requires different kinds of modeling, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and so we certainly don't. There's a lot of weather variability, and with climate change, it's going to be more variable. So we everything is based on estimates, which makes it a little challenging. But certainly, that's the goal: is to use this to allow us to plan in advance to prevent any.
Yeah. And do you guys do research that can help us understand how economics impacts the environment? So, we're in this global economy right now where people can just buy stuff that's resourced wherever in the world. And so somebody buying a product might not know that it's actually causing deforestation in Brazil or Indonesia or Africa, or, like, kind of know the consequences of what we're doing. Are you able to blend like economics with environmental issues like that?
Sure, I would say that the most direct ways that we're actually working directly with a lot of companies to green their supply chains. So a lot of that basically means that we want to make sure that their supply chains are not causing deforestation. That's probably the biggest one. There certainly are other issues in terms of, making sure it doesn't impact biodiversity too much, or water regimes and things like this. We do have most of our work in this way on making sure that they're deforestation-free supply chains. So we work with different companies, particularly food companies, big food companies, to make sure that to help them understand where they're sourcing their commodities, right, and understanding which areas around those source farms are experiencing deforestation, to allow them to go there and try and intervene and actually help the farmers to find ways to have good livelihoods without having to expand into other new lands. And so there's a lot of pressure these days on companies to make sure that they're generally green, and that they're not causing deforestation. So they're feeling a lot of responsibility. I'd say both pressure and responsibility to the public, and also from a profit standpoint, that they want to be seen as a good company so that they can sell their product. And so we're working with them to help make sure that they can monitor what their supply chains are doing or not doing to the environment, and then intervene as necessary.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is bringing up for me the issue too of how we have such a crowded world now. Like, we've got 8 billion people doing a whole bunch of things. And it used to be that nature was plentiful, and now it's getting crowded out. And so there's a lot of, even for a given spot of land, sort of competition about what that spot of land should be. Should we be protecting it as forest? Should it be farms? Should we be growing something else there? Should it be developed? Like, there's just so much pressure on all these places, and there's all these like competing needs of different people wanting things, or different people wanting to produce things or use it in a different way. And do you see ways that these data tools are helping us manage those frictions, or understanding the consequences of, like, okay, this spot, should we use it this way or should we use it that way?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring this up, because actually I would say WRI recently produced what I would say is probably the most comprehensive analysis of this basic issue, is like, what to do with our land. And it's in a report that's called Creating a Sustainable Food Future.
Mm-hmm.
And and you can find it on our website. And the report is about 600 pages long, but there is an executive summary that's 100 pages long. And there are press articles about it all over that you can look for if you want a quicker summary. But the gist of what it did was, and I was lucky enough to actually be one of the primary reviewers for it, so I was quite, I know the work pretty closely. And it basically is looking at how can we, as you said, the population is growing, so there's going to be an increased demand for food, right? Over the next X number of years. We're focused on next 20 to 70 years, maybe, or 20 to 80 years. And but we do see a likely leveling off of the population after some time. So it's not exponentially growing, So how can we feed the expected increase in population while and ideally equitably, so that we make sure everyone is well enough fed, as much as possible, while making sure that we don't increase our carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere too much. And part of that means that we're going to have to have enough forest area to soak up some of this carbon, because that's one of the biggest ways that we're going to have to address climate change, is by maintaining and growing forests. And so, but of course, forests take up land and agriculture takes up land. So, and we need both. And so, how do we do this, right? So one of the biggest issues is making sure that we have efficient agriculture, so that we can grow a lot of food on the land we are allocating to food, and which would leave us the ability for us to protect a lot of the forest area. And I think it's key to note that protecting the forest is more important than growing new forests, because if you cut a hectare of forest land, you're just, it's a big pulse of carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere within days to months to years, rather than growing forests on a hectare of land, which will take tens of years to kind of bring back that same amount of carbon into the earth. So with that perspective of how to manage all this, how are the data tools we're creating and using, how do they actually make an impact? One of the ways is certainly, like I was just talking about with Global Forest Watch, helping folks be able to monitor where the forests are being cut down and stop it as quickly as possible. But also monitoring where the forests are, where there's trees, where there's not trees, monitoring where there's agriculture and how efficient the agriculture is. We can do a lot of this with satellite imagery. And of course, monitoring yields is actually one of the more difficult challenges with satellite imagery, but there's been some progress, and that can help us figure out where there are areas that we need to really focus on increasing yields and increasing tree cover and things like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually, some data and mapping like what you described that actually caused me several months ago to radically reduce my consumption of meat. Right. I don't want to proselytize too much, but, it became aware to me how crowded the planet is and how much of the earth is being used for agriculture, and then how much of that agriculture is based on just feeding our animals in this sort of
Right.
inefficient system. And that's something that I think, I mean, past generations had no clue about this impact that we're having. And even now we're starting to understand, and like, wow, this is something, it's convincing to me.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point you make. And that's kind of one of the biggest takeaways from this creating a sustainable food future report was that the best way to reduce your carbon footprint in the world is to reduce the intake uh, of beef and sheep or goat. Those are the big ones. Obviously, for folks in the U.S., it's mostly beef is the one that makes the impact. So it's amazing if you look at the carbon impact of, let's say, legumes like beans and chickpeas and things. The amount of carbon that puts into the atmosphere compared to the same amount of nutrition that you would get from beef. They used to think it was about 10 or 20 times as much from impact from beef because of the carbon emissions and everything. But actually, what the creating a sustainable food future shows is that it's far more than that, because the cows take up so much land, and that's impacting how much forest is being cut down. So if you consider the land use impact and the fact that we can't use that land for forests to soak up carbon, I don't remember the numbers, but it's something like 100 times as much. So let me also say that I love steak. I really love steak.
Too.
I love hamburgers.
It's yummy. I get it. Yeah.
But I have changed, and I haven't stopped eating, but I've changed my behavior, and I eat a lot less beef than I used to. It's partly, I think it's good for health reasons in general, but it's really critical for the environment. That is by far the biggest thing anyone can do on a personal level to have a better impact on the climate. It's amazing what you can do by just eating less beef. If the world would eat half the beef that they're eating now, it would be a massive push towards a better planet. And I'm trying to eat less than half of what I used to eat, and that's my goal.
Right. Yeah. I'm noticing as we talk about this that to gain this insight about meat that we're talking about right now required collaboration between nutritionists, farming experts, atmospheric modeling, of the climate, land use mapping. Like such a collection of expertise had to come together for us to have this understanding, which is pretty darn interesting. Like, that's good stuff.
Yeah, I agree. It's amazing the exponential rate at which knowledge is growing these days. And a lot of it is because of this interdisciplinary work that's becoming more and more, I don't know if I'd say the word popular, but it's more and more of the trend than it ever used to be. And it's critical to solving these grand challenges of the world. And yeah, I agree. It's fascinating to see how information comes from so many different sources and how it's used together. It's great.
Yeah. And now we have an internet to connect all these different researchers, and people can share information so easily and widely. It's pretty awesome.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Assuming that folks don't get the wrong information. One of the downsides of the internet is also the fact that you can get the wrong information very easily, or information that's uncertain, and people can interpret that information in the wrong way as well. So there's certainly these risks in addition to the benefits.
Yeah. Have you seen examples of that where a public conversation sort of went awry because people were misunderstanding data or oversimplifying it or just not using it right?
I don't know that I can think of exactly an answer to that, but I can talk about a related problem that I think is an issue.
Sure.
And that is there have been a lot of work. There's been a lot of work going on with the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, to understand what's happening with the climate and what are the likely scenarios moving forward in terms of how much warming there'll be and what the weather effects will be in different parts of the world, climate effects. And the biggest number is the overall global warming number. You know, how many degrees centigrade will we be warming in 5, 10 years, 20 years, things like this. And there have been a lot of different estimates. You know, there's a lot of different models that are put together through and have been, and the estimates can vary from, we have these, I don't remember what they're called, but they're the good scenarios to the very bad scenarios, right? So there's a wide range of estimates. You know, if we manage our carbon output and we grow enough trees, and we're going to have some, you know, lower expected increases in temperature over the next decades. And if we don't manage to, it's going to be higher than expected. And you know, these are all models, so they all have a lot of uncertainty in them as well. So when reporting some of this, it's very easy to just take the average or the middle climate scenario, climate change scenario. And a lot of reporters were reporting on the middle or most expected climate change scenario. It looks like, with the new data coming in, that actually the climate change is more towards some of these higher expected changes. So that's really unfortunate. But a lot of governments and companies actually were using these expected changes to plan how to adapt to these climate changes. But they were planning with what may be the wrong number, because it was actually one of the higher ones, because the mean or the median is not necessarily the right one. It's just the one that we're used to reporting. So I would say that's the kind of challenge that is common, and this is a big one here. So, hopefully these companies and governments are recognizing this and changing their adaptation plans very quickly. But
yeah, well, and people could, if they misunderstand that projection, they might say, oh, well, we've got time to deal with it, or, oh, we don't need to take really drastic action because, we'll be okay. And it could cause people to just sort of drag their feet when we really need urgent action.
Absolutely.
So, and also, too, I guess, with a range of possibilities like that, what if the most extreme is correct? And we're just not understanding that as a possibility.
Right. And it looks like one of the more extreme is correct. It doesn't necessarily mean the most, but it looks like the one of the more extreme is correct, at least at this point, for various reasons, whether it's, uncertainty in estimates of input variables or certain things, certain feedback loops that are happening. Some melting makes, they're talking about this on glaciers, the melting actually makes the glaciers melt faster just because of some physical processes that they didn't expect. I don't understand them all. It's not my area, but
there's various feedback loops and such that can get triggered and then make it worse. So, yeah, and I think part of the challenge with this type of modeling too is that the future depends on our actions. So there's this modeling around just how the atmosphere and the climate acts, and that's a complex system. But then, there's different outcomes based on human activity. So a higher emissions path versus a lower emissions path, and that adds a whole other layer of complexity to trying to figure out what the future might look like, because we don't know, to what extent we're going to get our emissions under control. So it's hard to really say, oh yeah, that's going to happen, because we haven't made the future happen yet.
Exactly. And even as we're doing things, it's hard to even monitor very well what our emissions are. It's not an easy task just to know what your emissions are. Although it's impressive how well, it has been able to be quantified or at least estimated. But certainly the future is not known.
Yeah, often in conversations about important issues like this, when people offer predictions, I tend to kind of discount it. I mean, it's important to look forward, but I like to think in terms of possibilities rather than predictions, because really nobody knows for sure until it happens. But these predictive tools are incredibly important for understanding the impact of various decisions or behaviors.
Yeah, I just can't agree with you more. Exactly. We don't know what the future holds. The different predictive scenarios are useful, but it's important to recognize that even in these scenarios, there's a lot of uncertainty in the predictive ability of them.
Yeah. Do you think that over time, what am I trying to say? What does it look like, this process of trying to teach people about how to use data better or to understand these nuances? Like, I don't know, these are some challenging conversations, I think, when you deal with a politician or a business leader or something. Like, it's important that they understand the nuances. Is that a hard conversation to get people to understand it?
It's a very important topic for one, I would say. It's not a part of the work. This kind of work is not something I'm involved with.
Yeah, I know. There's other people who are the lobbyists and the communications folks. I get it.
Exactly, yeah. But I think, you know, there's always a bit of a tension between producing information or explaining information in a way that's precise and incorporates all the uncertainty involved, and one that's actionable, right? And so we want to say, you know, you should do this in order to have this outcome. That's the best thing for a policymaker, for instance. But, you know, a lot of times we might say, well, if you reduce your, you know, emissions by this amount, then, you know, we expect that air pollution levels will go down this amount, but it could be this amount. You know, the range is between X and Y, and that's 95% confidence interval, which means that there's a 5% chance it could be outside that. You know, but if you say all these things, no one's going to listen to you. It's already beyond most people.
Or they'll just be frozen when you give them the full complexity of it. They'll just be boggled. Exactly. Won't know what to do. So
it's what, and so some of it starts from really understanding what we do and don't know, and then making the best decisions we can about what's the best policies or interventions that would be based on that, and then very clearly explaining that and working directly with people, the recipients of the information, the policymakers or the business leaders, so that it's not just some statement out there that they may hear about, but you actually work with them and say, you know, how can we, you know, what are your opportunities to make it, to change processes and operations and in order to fulfill certain goals, and you know, working with them to understand the data and what their interventions, how that may affect, you know, the future, whether it's carbon emissions or water impacts or whatever it is they're looking at.
Yeah. You know, I'm thinking about how with with this population explosion we've had in the complexity of our world economy and new technology, it's like the world is getting more complex. At least it feels this way to me. And then on top of that, we've got all this added data that we can understand about it, which is complicated to swim through. It just, you know, my humble perception as one imperfect human in the world is that there's just this growing complexity around me that is hard to sift through. And yet we have the same human brain that we've always had. So we've got all this added knowledge, but yet how to cram it in here is kind of tricky. Do you think the state of the art is growing or improving in sort of managing that complexity to make it actionable or communicable, like so that somebody can actually get it, you know, like using different graphing or satellite imagery or different ways of communicating numbers? Or is that sort of capability improving?
I would say, I mean, I'm very impressed with our communications team, because they really have great ways of thinking through complex ideas and putting it into a simple graph to explain, to folks. But sometimes it's challenging, and sometimes we come up with graphs that aren't so simple, and it's always a challenge. I think, I don't know if I can comment on, how the world is moving in this way, but I would say that it's always important. I mean, like you said, there's so much information out there, and we can't expect people to cram all this information into their heads. So it's really about having the science community work directly with the intended users of the information that the science is producing, and figuring out, in every unique case, how to get that information best to those recipients of the information. And I think, and that's at least as important as the science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's not always about like getting everybody to learn everything. It's about getting the right person to learn the right thing that they need. Yeah.
Yes.
Which requires a sort of mapping of society and politics in who's who,
Yes.
who needs what.
Absolutely. And that's what WRI is excellent at. We have, folks who are very well connected to ministries of governments all around the world, and to the United Nations, and to the World Bank, and we're working with top folks and companies everywhere, and that is the real strength of WRI, that I feel really privileged to work with WRI, because we're actually having an influence through these networks and connections. And ideally, we're going to keep this all based on the fundamental science, which is where my role is, to make sure that the information that does get out there, we're basing it on science with integrity that's been reviewed and can be backed up by facts and experimentation.
Mm-hmm. Has anything come along lately that surprised you in its ingenuity? Like, wow, some researcher came up with this? Like, I didn't know you could collect data on that. Like, does anything kind of come along that's interesting like that? In terms of people's capabilities to understand things?
Yeah, I would say one thing that surprises me is just how well we're able to assess carbon emissions by sector, assessing how much emissions are coming from agriculture, how much from electricity generation or heavy industry, and from cutting forests down, or the land use change in general. Now, there are big error bars in all these. We don't know how much is in each one, but they're estimates, and it's just amazing how we can look at such a large scale on countries and globally to understand how much carbon dioxide, or how much carbon is being emitted from agriculture, or carbon and methane, and some of these other greenhouse gases as well, and how much heavy industry is emitting. Like, we actually can get some decent estimates and assign this blame, or this responsibility to these different industries, and then that allows us to target a certain amount of reductions in a certain amount of time, and then monitor how well we've been able to act in each of these sectors to reach these targets. And so much of this is dependent on the monitoring, and it's just amazing that we can even get relatively decent estimates on a country level of how much our cars or certain kinds of industries are polluting the atmosphere, or are putting up carbon emissions. I think it's fascinating.
You can even assess a type of activity happening around the world, like really worldwide data coming together to understand it.
Yes, and sometimes that comes from assessing what's happening in the atmosphere, but a lot of times it comes from synthesizing information from all the different countries. But we have a lot of that data, and then some is better than others. But it's just an amazing amount of infrastructure that's needed in order to get that kind of information. And so I'm kind of floored that we can even do things at this scale.
Yeah.
But it's critical too. We need to, because we need to monitor it, so we can monitor how we're going to improve, which obviously is critical to improve these to reduce our carbon footprint. And I just hope that the science and the governments and the companies can all get together, along with the nonprofit world to actually make the difference that we need.
Mhm.
But it all starts with measuring it.
Yeah, yeah. So WRI is one amazing group doing this kind of work. And I know there are additional organizations who are using some of these powerful research tools to understand the world and communicate. Like, if you look at sort of humanity's ability to understand its impacts and make good decisions, like with these tools, what do we need to do to increase this all? I mean, and keep enhancing and growing this sector to just make the most of it. Because I'm assuming we don't have all the world's problems solved yet. And so, like, how do we keep it going? How do we grow this and make more happen?
Right. Well, that's a very good question. I think the key is I think one of the biggest ways that we can do this is by having governments put their money, their public funds into science, and that means education. That means research and development. But there also needs to be private-public partnerships. So, government working with companies that also put funding into R&D. So I think those are the keys. Yeah, I think we just need to fund research and development, because sometimes, the payoff is a lot longer term for some research and development. So it's not necessarily in a company's best interest all the time to focus on that, because they're maybe focused on returns on a scale of 1 to 10 or 20 years. And some of these returns might be more, might be on a longer term than that. Certainly, preventing climate change is something that could be on a scale of 50 to 100 years. And a lot of folks in business may not be motivated by stockholders to focus on something like such that's so long term. But it's for all of humanity. We need to focus on this. And if you look at the amount of research and development and science funding there is, it's really quite small compared to a lot of the other sectors from governments around the world. So I think that's the easiest way to move this forward.
Yeah, yeah. I sometimes do notice the mismatch between, all our various technical tools in the world. Like, if you compare for-profit areas in technology that are making so many billions of dollars right now, and yet the nonprofit sector studying how to save the world just does not get the same funding. And I'd love to see that balanced to where a society in general prioritized knowledge about these important issues and invested in it.
Yeah, I agree. Although I will say that there's at least some movement now that where these big companies, a lot of the big tech firms, are putting some money into these, and both through funding. I mean, we get a lot of money from, for instance, we receive money from the Gates Foundation and from the Bezos Earth Fund, and so they're putting money into these foundations that are going to nonprofits, but also the companies themselves are working with organizations like ours and with governments to try and solve some of these problems. Mm-hmm. But I completely agree that it's still not at the scale at all that we need, and we need to make sure that there's so much wealth being generated, and a lot of that wealth needs to be prioritized on and put back into science and research, and making sure that research is actually being used in ways to make a difference.
Yeah. Something I hope for, and maybe today's conversation is a small contribution to it, but I feel like if the public really understood the capabilities of this kind of research, that they might have higher expectations of their government and businesses that they support with their purchases. So, like, in my life, I've done some public policy work, and it shocked me sometimes when I would be with a policymaker that's making important decisions just based on gut instinct or intuition. And I'd be like, no, wait, really, we could collect some data on that. Are you sure you don't want some data before you make that really important decision? And so I think if citizens had this understanding, they might say, hey, government official, did you study that before you decided? Did you hire WRI or somebody to help you with that? Do you have staff in your agencies that can really analyze this stuff well? You know, that kind of expectation by citizens might cause governments to sort of up their game and do things in a more sophisticated way.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think it's very important that for democracy in general, that's why a lot of this, I think, starts with governance, because in order to move the needle, we need to have better science and have that fed into policymakers and things. But we can't get that unless we have, a governance system that allows people's voices to be heard and that holds governments accountable for, what they do and to fund the science and the research. So it's all about governance first, I think.
Yeah.
Which includes an informed democracy and an informed electorate, as well as holding the government itself accountable.
Yeah. And maybe journalists being on board with this too, because they ask the tough questions of public officials. And so when a public official comes out with a recommendation or a proposal, the journalist should be right there saying, hey, show us your research. You
Yes, and
first, right? Show us your research.
And where's the money coming from the journalists? This is certainly not my area, but making sure that the journalists don't have, funding or political motivations that are outside of really finding the truth, and that's part of governance as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm curious what the future might look like for WRI or just the field of research in general. Like if we start to have even better tools like stronger computing or artificial intelligence or even better satellite imagery or other tools I haven't even imagined or don't know about yet. But with better tools, are there things on your wish list that you guys would love to be able to study if the capability grows?
I would imagine that every department in our organization would have a different set of wishes on this list.
Yeah.
But absolutely. But I'd say some of the ones that come to my mind are, forests are huge in terms of what's being cut down, what's growing at what rates, how much carbon are they sequestering, how much carbon is being released. These are challenging questions, especially to monitor globally. So if we can get better at using satellite imagery or other means to more precisely monitor forest restoration and forest cutting and degradation, I think that would be a really big boost for us. And that, we're actually working on that right now. We've got a lot of resources put towards being able to monitor the Earth regularly and get more information out of that from satellite imagery. Another area is we're doing a lot of work on understanding generation by power plants, how much electricity is being generated, and what the carbon impacts may be of that. But there's so many power plants around the world, and a lot of times they don't divulge all their data to, it's not open. So trying to find other ways to learn about how much electricity they're generating and what their emissions are. And I think so that would be an area that we're really interested in moving forward. And I would say the biggest recent push, especially in the era of post George Floyd, is we're really focusing on equity issues in every department. And so how are all the policies that we're talking about in every sector affecting equity issues, and who's reaping the benefits and who's taking the risks, and how can we minimize the risks, especially to the more vulnerable. So I'm not saying there's one data source that's going to be focusing on this, but just thinking through, what data we need in all these areas, it's kind of where we're headed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're doing amazing work. I'm just thrilled by all of what I'm hearing. And I do, though, feel some empathy for you because it must be a brain crunch. Like, this is not easy work that you do. So,
Well, I appreciate it. I feel like, I'm very happy I made the move to WRI. I only moved here about 2.5 years ago. And I'm doing less of my own research, but working on research in many areas, in different ways. And it's been such a pleasure to learn about and to feel like I'm having even a small impact on some of this. And I think it's incredibly important and it's fascinating to be a part of. Sometimes it can be tiring on the mind, but I just play some ping pong to take a break and then I'm fine.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, you've been super generous with your time. And I can let you go whenever, but is there anything that we should have covered that we missed?
I think we chatted a little bit beforehand about some topics we talk about, and I think we basically covered them, and happy to provide more insight in the future if that's useful. But I just would say thank you, Shelby, and I think you're doing great work to try and get all this information out to folks. And grow your audience, to have people really think through some of the more, fine points about what's, about the environmental issues and about the grand challenges that the world is facing. And we all need to be thinking about it because you can't leave it to just a few people to focus on. Everyone needs to do their part. And I would say to your audience members, because a lot of times I feel like, a little helpless, in whether it's in government or in the environment, like, what can I do? I'm just one person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one big thing we can do is eat less beef. Mm-hmm. And what I also say is that means that the beef you do eat, you've got to really enjoy.
Exactly. Make it count for the whole month.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. But really, eating less beef is the easiest thing we can do to make a difference in the environment on a personal level.
Right. Yeah. There you go. That's what data teaches us. Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so happy that we had this conversation. This was a lot of fun, really interesting.
I really enjoyed it, Shelby. Thank you for having me.
And dear listener, thanks to you for being with us. I'm glad that you've, stayed with us and enjoyed this information, hopefully. And until next time, let's just try to be the best people we can be. I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Thanks for listening, but you're not done yet. We can't change the world if we keep the joy of saving the human race to ourselves. Help me spread the word and help this movement grow. Please subscribe to the show, both the podcast and the YouTube channel. Leave ratings or reviews, which encourages others to listen. Share this show with others on your social media. Even better, just tell a friend about it and have a good conversation about the state of the world. These things really make a difference. I hope you can help the show grow and reach a larger audience. I'm grateful for your help. Thank you. And please stay in touch with me. I love to get feedback, suggestions, and questions. Go to the website at joyofsavingthehumanrace.com. At the website, you'll learn more about the show, and you can sign up to get occasional email updates. Thanks to Moby for the show's theme music, and thanks to you for being here. All right, we're done for today. Be well. I'll talk to you soon.